Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons.
So glad you could join us today. I'm Ron Finn, along with Shayne Stanfield, for what promises to be a pretty exciting look at an interesting topic and a book title. We're going to talk about guilt today, Shayne.
Oh, boy. A great time for Lent, our great theme for Lent.
Absolutely. And looking forward to speaking to a guest. We've had Kristen Van Uden on, a couple of times
Absolutely,
now.
Yeah.
And always a delight to chat with her, especially about books that are either coming back into print or we can be called attention to those books available on Sophia Press. And this time we're talking about the literary classic Guilt by Caryll Houselander. And Kristen is joining us to chat about that. Kristen Van Uden serves as an author, spokesperson at Sophia Institute Press. She received her master's in history from the College of William and Mary and her BA in history and Russian from St. Anselm College. She studies the persecution of Catholics under communist regimes. Now, Kristen's been featured on a whole wide range of media platforms, Coast to Coast, AM, The Federalist, and the Catholic Faith Network, and other spots as well. So I'm glad that she could take the time to join us today to talk about this wonderful book. Kristen Van Uden, welcome to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hello, thanks so much for having me back.
Well, thanks for being willing to come back. I guess we must have not scared you off last time.
I didn't treat her so harshly.
That's right.
I can't remember which book we were talking about last time, but I think it had something to do with the apocalypse, maybe. There's a good bet. So many of our recent titles do. So either that or Purgatory, maybe.
Because we've chatted a couple of times. It's always a fascinating conversation, and it brings me and it brings all of our listeners to their Catholic bookstore and to Sophia Institute Press to order them, and a lot of Kindle downloads as well, and so forth. So, and of course, awesome. We encourage people to head over to, you can go to sophiainstitute.com /product/guilt. You can go to facebook.com, Sophia Institute Press, or twitter.com, Sophia Press, and learn all about this book. And first of all, tell us how you are doing.
Well, I am doing great. I am in the midst of writing my own book, actually, so I might have mentioned this last time.
Yeah,
but
I think you were just getting started on it at that point.
Yes, that's right. So as you said in your intro, I study Catholics who survived communism. So I've been really privileged over the last couple months to conduct interviews with Catholics of all walks of life, from countries such as Cuba to Czechoslovakia to Hungary to potentially even China, to discuss their experiences under the atheistic regimes of communism, which, despite their geographic disparity, all share the same really anti-Christ ideology. And it's been amazing to see the testimonies of people, whether they suffered more of a white martyrdom of not being able to get a job, nor education, nor sort of social opportunities, all the way up to imprisonment. I talked to a gentleman who was imprisoned for 17 years in Cuba, and even death, witnessed martyrdoms down in the prisons there. And, of course, we all know the stories from many places in Eastern Europe. Cardinal Vincenti from Hungary, for example, has just celebrated his quote-unquote feast. I know he's not a saint yet, but this is something that's getting a little bit more attention, luckily, lately. There are several new memoirs out, and so my book will really focus on preserving these individual stories. So even though they may not be the most dramatic, I think it's important to take account of all of them, because this is not something that's going away, unfortunately. We're facing, in the very least, a culture war here in the West. And, of course, as we know, in other parts of the globe, persecution for the faith has even taken a bloody turn. And this ideology of communism itself is kind of transmogrified into the stranglehold that we see in the culture war in the West, and then, of course, informs still overtly communist in places such as China and North Korea. And so I have always been inspired mainly when I studied history in reading individual stories. They're things that stick with me the most. They're almost these icons of grace in the same way that saints are, when you can access the truths of the faith through these lives of the saints. it's in so much more of an immediate way than studying reams of sacred theology, in my opinion. So that is a project that I'll have to wrap up next couple months. And the writing and editing process is a whole different part of that. So I've done the research, so now it's just sitting down to do it. And that'll probably be out in November. So keep an eye out.
Yeah, and we'll definitely want to welcome you back on here to take us into that book for sure as soon as it comes out.
Yeah, thank you.
Looking forward to that. And, of course, we learn so much from our saints and from those who went before us and really from those still living that are being persecuted today about what, we all take our faith for granted sometimes. And especially if we're, living in fat, happy land, we don't get, we're seeing more and more challenges just on the streets on a day-to-day basis. We're seeing all these attacks. We know that the evil one is seriously has upped his game, so to speak. At least it seems that way to me. And to be able to look to others as an example, it helps us remember this communion of saints and the communion of our brothers and sisters currently, our church militant right now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Another Sophia title that I'm representing lately is called Evidence of Satan in the Modern World. And the other day at the office, I couldn't find the book, and I was like, am I missing Evidence of Satan in the Modern World? Oh, yeah. And I realized what I said. I was like, wait a second. And everyone laughed, and they're like, yeah, you kind of backed yourself into that one. But it's so true that it's all around us, and you can't step outside, or not. You don't even have to go outside. Just the internet is probably one of the places where it's most infested by evidence of Satan. So it's easy to get discouraged, but during these times, you also see the great drama of heroic Catholics, too. So it's always inspiring to see those who will likely become saints in our day and to try to strive to be a little braver with representing the faith each day and looking to these contemporary saints or saint-like people, like the people I interviewed or like some of the more contemporary works that we're releasing, maybe even Caryll Houselander's work, can be really helpful in navigating the unique challenges that are presented to us today. They're always Satan's temptations from ancient times, just in repackaged forms, but it's helpful to see the more modern toolbox to combat that.
Well, it's interesting to me that you mentioned this uptick in interest to those that have been persecuted previously under these communist regimes, and then you mentioned that this is obviously activity that we're now starting to see in the Western world, and you may have some room for a follow-up, maybe a second book, just to describe what's going on here in the Western world, and try to compare or contrast that with which is not only currently continuing today under these communist regimes, but what's happened in the past. And we see and it's frightful, but we see so many similarities.
Oh, absolutely. It's taken on a much softer approach here in the West, a lot more subtle. So I know lots has been written about warning on this. We have Bill Donahue, who just published with Sophia, The War on Virtue, which talks about this. Rod Dreher, of course, has addressed how this has taken the softer totalitarian approach in the West. A book that I would really recommend on this topic that is just jam-packed with facts and was really stunning in its conclusions is called American Betrayal. And this isn't a Catholic book, so it's a little off topic, but by Diana West. And she talks about how a lot of actual collusion with elements in the U.S. government with actual Soviet agents occurred throughout the 20th century, and how none of this is an accident. So if you're noticing something is wrong and it seems like you're fighting a battle, and even here in America in this culture war, that is something that's real. You're not going crazy. And of course, ultimately the devil is in charge of this, but it's fascinating to learn how these basically seemingly cultural rules that have been totally thrown upside down have come into place. And this is interesting, too, because it's kind of something that Houselander herself in the book we're discussing today addresses, is that with this advent of psychology as religion, that really started to take over by the 50s. So before that, the 30s, that was the age of Freud, where these theories were still considered revolutionary. But it used to be that the underpinnings of society were based on Christianity and Christian values. Even if the person was not a practicing Catholic or Christian, there were these things that marked the year, the liturgical calendar, obviously, the values and morals of society that were sort of the backbone behind laws and the legal system, and the way people thought about the world and approached each other. And that was in no small part due to psychology, but also other forces of atheism and modernism thrown on its head in the 20th century. And so this is one of the great topics of this book, Guilt, and also a couple other books by Sophia, including one called Psychology and the Cross, where instead of explaining the faculties of the soul through a complete understanding of the human person as possessing a soul, it was all reduced to materialism and basically ascribing to humanity this animalistic qualities where they deny the existence of the soul, and so everything has to be explained in a more empirical way. And so rather than having religion as the basis of society, it was this Freudian id and the idea of repression and human as animal, and this just chaos of a dog-eat-dog world that really resembles hell. Like, what is humanity without a soul? It's hell. So that is the psychological and intellectual background to what we're experiencing today, in addition to all these facts and conspiracies and all of that. I think it is crucial in our understanding of how we got here, and that can in turn give us the tools to combat it, and even in our own small ways.
You speak of this, and I'm reminded of modern philosophy and how that's really come unhinged from classical. The understanding that it's the idea you're moving toward relativism or fueling relativism, and you mentioned the materialism here, and this is what comes to mind for me, and it's scary because you really are devolving society.
Yeah, it's true. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you reduce man to an animal, then that's how he'll act. And just tons of books keep bubbling up to my mind as we're talking about this other book. So buy Sophia's book, but here are some more. Another one I remember reading in my studies of the Holocaust was called Ordinary Men. And it was really interesting because it tracked the development of this Einsatzgruppen, which was basically the Nazis who committed the Holocaust in the Far East. So in the Far East, there were not camps to begin with. They had to shoot people one-on-one, en masse, all day. So very hands-on, direct, bloody way of murder that did not leave any room for denial of what was happening. Because with the camps, there was a certain machine-like aspect to that, where someone who's a cog in the machine can sort of have this distance from the actual business of killing and can lie to themselves and use euphemisms to really kind of pretend it's not happening or not feel the horror of the killing. But when it's one-on-one like that, it's really, really in your face and you have to reckon with it. And this book studied these men who had been just normal guys before the war. They had been accountants, family men, just had day-to-day, seemingly boring jobs, clerks, things like that. And they automatically turned into these cold-blooded killers when given the opportunity and when placed in the correct circumstances for that to be rewarded through the feedback loop of the army and of the Nazi ideology. And so it was scary and sobering to see that without a strong, objective moral code, which, as we know, comes from having a religion and the Catholic religion founded in truth, then it's so easy for human beings to degenerate into this total depravity and evil, and to not even blink goes along with the idea of the banality of evil, where if there is no objective truth, then you need only to be placed in different circumstances for truth to change. And that's the great danger of relativism, is that even though your truth here may not be dangerous, quote unquote, to others right now, if you've rejected the idea of truth altogether, then anything goes.
Boy, relativism is all around us, isn't it? Kristen Van Uden is our guest on Faith with Reasons today, and we want to talk a bit about Caryll Houselander, who died in 1954, 68 years ago, and has just a literary genius, obviously. And you don't have to go too far to find things written that are really inspired writings by Caryll Houselander. In fact, we were talking just before we went on the air, Kristen, that even just reading my Magnificat, there's almost always, every month there's almost always a reflection by Caryll in there. So she had a lot to say and really gave us a lot. Can you give us a little background on Caryll? I know she was a kind of a self-described neurotic and had some very difficult times in her life. But what can you tell us about Caryll Houselander?
Yeah, so she was born in England in 1902. She had one sister, and she was born Anglican. So she cites her conversion as she wrote a memoir of it called The Rocking Horse Catholic, because she's not a cradle Catholic, but she's a rocking horse Catholic, in the sense that she converted somewhat early in life. She converted when she was still a child. I think she was a teenager, and sort of went head-to-head a bit with her mother over this, and was ostracized by her social community, of course. And I think this obviously must have had some sort of influence on her mental health, just the feeling of persecution and of ostracization. But yes, she is a self-described neurotic, which of course is somewhat of an outdated term now, but she uses throughout her books to describe really all manner of mental illness. And so she never had any formal training in psychology, but she really engages with the thinkers in that field, and in a very critical way often, as they are largely atheists, as Freud himself was, for example. And interestingly enough, as she grew older, she had this sort of ministry where, in addition to writing, priest friends would send her some of their more difficult cases. So those that they were counseling for diseases of the soul, as they were called, just these either circumstances in their lives or issues with self-confidence or even deeper mental health issues that they just were not making major progress on with spiritual means alone. And so they would send them to Caryll rather than to a psychologist, although I'm sure in many cases they did involve medical community as well. And she would be able to work almost these miracles with them in building them up and providing these people with perspective, which of course was grounded in the faith, because by then she was a strong, flourishing Catholic. So she had sort of this special mission. She's also been referred to as a mystic before, and of course we always have to be a little bit wary of personal revelations that have not been approved by the church. But she gives account of several times where she had mystical visions or experiences of our Lord, which just seemed to point to his suffering during the Passion. So no sort of big revelations or prophecies or apocalyptic visions or anything like that. She also interestingly claims that she had a vision of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia being killed,
Really?
and likens that to the crucifixion somehow. So she had a very strong sense of time and place and of the collapse of the ordered world into the chaos of modernity. She's writing right after the Second World War, mainly. This book was published in the 50s originally. So the Holocaust clearly has a strong influence on her writing as well. She, in this book, uses several case studies of people who, all throughout history, she kind of diagnoses guilt as the central issue with their particular neurosis. And one of them was a Holocaust guard who, sort of similarly to the book we were talking about a few minutes ago, just turned into a total bestial, just awful sadist in the camps when given that opportunity to kind of act out this revenge on humanity. So she had a lot of material to work with, basically, from witnessing the 20th century from afar, but also from the experience she had on the ground with these individuals that she worked with through the priests and her own upbringing.
You can see a lot of these. You could, I think, assume a lot of these cases that she's dealing with people that have really cornered themselves into a form of depression, because of unresolved guilt that leads to a despair. I mean, this all seems to me to be very much related to more of a self-imposed depression. And I think from what little I know about neurosis itself, it's something that's not physical. So you're not dealing with somebody necessarily with with an actual a problem physically with the brain, chemically, that would necessarily need medication for treatment, but you're dealing with something that is caused by somebody's state of mind. Basically, they're dealing with something that's unresolved in their lives.
Yeah. So basically, the thesis of Caryll's book is that unresolved guilt is at the core of all mental health issues.
Wow.
And it's a very bold claim, and I'm not sure if I can 100% endorse it altogether, but she really does make a good point in that we are given, through the Catholic faith, the proper means to expiate guilt. Mm-hmm. We are born with original sin, as we know, and we're born into this fallen human race, and we also commit sins inevitably throughout our life. And through going to confession, the extreme supernatural healing that we gain through that sacrament is something that we cannot achieve with human means alone.
Yeah.
So when we have guilt, and this is really, what would literature be without guilt? You think of things like Raskolnikov from Dostoevsky, and just tons of literature where people are haunted when Lady Macbeth, for example, trying to scrub out the blood from the murder she had committed, and she can't get it out, so the guilt haunts her. This guilt is there for a reason, because it points us to the fact of sin, and it points us to the fact that we have free will and can choose to sin or can choose not to sin. We have free will so that we may avoid evil and do good, not so that we can do whatever we want. And so guilt serves a purpose, and its purpose is to get us into the confessional and to expiate our sins, be forgiven, absolved by Christ himself through the priest, the faculties he has given to the priesthood, and then to do penance and to forget the sin and to go and sin no more. So there can be an excess of guilt, certainly, and we see this a lot with scrupulosity, which she sort of does address in the book. Just the idea that after your sin has been forgiven, to hold on to it, as she puts it, is a sin of pride, because God has forgiven you. So who are you to say you know better than God? So guilt does serve a purpose, and it exists for a reason. But when people are not going through the proper channels to get rid of that guilt, it can manifest in all of these many different unhealthy ways. And that's the crux of her book. And she makes, again, this very bold claim that, and she, on one page, I can't find it, but she gives a whole list of conditions that she believes are caused by unresolved guilt. And they're ones that you would expect, like depression, anxiety, agoraphobia, especially, just feelings of persecution. But they go to kind of extremes or things you wouldn't necessarily think of. So physical symptoms, I think she put one in there, like breaking out in rashes or unresolved itching, things like that, more psychosomatic problems. Mm-hmm. Just kind of ahead of her time, medically speaking, but she has this very central thesis and this great insight into the human condition, where we know, just personal experience, that this feeling of being haunted when you know you should go to confession and you haven't, for example, and to imagine that writ large throughout society for people who have not yet found the faith, for example, or those who are living in denial about what they've done. It can easily be understood how that would come out as this paranoia would manifest in all these different ways.
Yeah, and this book is very helpful because, on the one sense, it gives us hope because we all deal with some form of guilt, and especially if we reflect back on our lives. But in this book, Caryll presents really some great examples of men and women through history that have battled some form of neurosis that either led to their sanctification or it led to their downfall, their destruction. And I think we can identify with a lot of people. And what do we do with that guilt? How do we channel that guilt? How do we resolve that? How do we grapple with that and come out on the other side, on the sanctification versus destruction side? So I think that's very helpful in this book.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, how at the end, with these series of case studies that she presents, she intersperses saints with sort of the great neurotics of her day. So she has people who met very bad ends or committed suicide or became Nazi prison guards, for example, next to people like St. Therese and St. I think he's a saint now, Charles Foucault, not to be confused with Michel Foucault, but the people who felt guilt and followed it to its purpose and found the solution in humility. And I think another really interesting example of this is right at the beginning of the church with the two examples of St. Peter versus Judas, because here we are presented with the two human solutions to guilt. On the one hand, Judas despairs in his guilt, and he feels that he can never be redeemed, that he's beyond saving because what he did was so horrible, and that despair leads him to suicide, versus the guilt of St. Peter after denying Christ 3 times, which is repentance. He is driven to weep over his sins and to feel probably equally bad about it, but to recognize and trust in our Lord of his promises of redemption and forgiveness. And so that is really the choice that is ahead of each of us every time we sin, is do we take the path of Judas and despair and all of the many ways and fractals that can take, which are given in the examples of these evil people from history or these people who are plagued by unmoored guilt, or do we take the role of St. Peter and to properly repent of our guilt in the right way and to have it cleansed through God's power, not through our own? And that's a really powerful image to keep ahead of us, is that despair is probably a feeling that we can't avoid. It's a feeling that will come to us at certain points in our life, but we can choose to trust God through that and choose to not give into it.
You mentioned previously that, she's made some very bold assertions here, particularly in the area of psychiatry or psychology. And of course, she wasn't professionally trained in this, but one would find that she should be fairly credible based on the number of people that she helped heal. That if priests were sending these folks to her and she witnessed healing in these folks based on, she had to know about their circumstances. She had to witness some of these attributes of their various sicknesses. She should be able to be some sort of an authoritative speaker in this area. One should assume.
And
she has.
You know what, Kristen? We're going to give you a couple of minutes to mull that over before you respond to it, because we're at a hard break right now. We're chatting with Kristen Van Uden of Sophia Institute Press, and we're talking about The Guilt, a literary classic by Caryll Houselander. And can't wait to come back on the other side and continue to talk about this and the author and this book. And, of course, the book is available from Sophia Institute Press. This is Faith with Reasons, and we'll be right back.
I'm Peter Range, Executive Director of Ohio Right to Life, and I'm a strong supporter of the Culture Project International. Friends, the foundation for the pro-life movement is the family. To rebuild the family, then, it's important we begin having those tough conversations with our kids about the purpose and meaning of sex, the value of the human person, and the dangers of social media. The Culture Project is an initiative of young people to address these fundamental issues. Please schedule them today at thecultureproject.org and support their mission to rebuild the family and rebuild our culture.
It's time for Annunciation Radio's 2023 spring campaign. Our theme is Say Yes. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Mother Angelica and giving thanks that she said yes. We're having a big dinner and a birthday party on Thursday, April the 27th at the Pinnacle in Maumee. Our special guest speakers are Bishop Thomas, as well as Father Joseph Wolf and Jack Williams from EWTN. To register, visit us at AnnunciationRadio.com or call 419-868-2966. If you recently received our newsletter, you also got a copy of my new book, Faith Over Fear, Lessons from My Life with Mother Angelica, which highlights my own personal experiences with her and how those interactions set the course for my life. I can't wait to celebrate Mother Angelica's extraordinary life with you. Again, for more information or to register, visit us at AnnunciationRadio.com or call 419-868-2966.
During this diocesan year of the National Eucharistic Revival, join us for a worshipful evening of prayer and Eucharistic adoration to enhance our understanding of, love for, and living out of the Holy Eucharist. The events run from Sunday, January 19th to Sunday, April 30th. Each event is from 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. To learn more, visit ToledoDiocese.org/Eucharist. That's ToledoDiocese.org/Eucharist.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. This is Shayne Stanfield with Ron Finn, and today we're blessed to have Kristen Van Uden. Kristen serves as author and spokesperson at Sophia Institute Press. She received her master's in history from the College of William and Mary and her BA in history and Russian from St. Anselm College. She studies the persecution of Catholics under communist regime, and she's currently working on a book in that regard. She's also been featured on a wide range of media platforms, including Coast to Coast, Federalist, and the Catholic Faith Network. Now, Ron poked at me here at the break because I'm not the radio professional, and I dumped a question on Kristen right before we cut to a break, and I made some assumptions on my part that weren't correct. I mean, I would think we would go to this at 4:30. I know it's at 4:27 and a half, and it only makes sense in radio land, I guess. But anyhow, I had asked or had made a statement about you, Kristen. You had said that she's not a medical professional, at least in psychology or psychiatry, and yet she's made some very bold claims. That I would say rubbed against the psychology of the day, or even modern psychology, and my thought was she would have to have some sort of credibility based on the number of people that she witnessed healed through her help. Priests were sending a number of people to her. In fact, I read someplace today. Somebody had written about her, and they said that she used to receive so many people that she would escape through her rear window. Oh wow! Yeah, so it just seems to me that if she's going to make such a bold assertion, she had to witness this, and I would think that these assertions, rather bold or not, they should be credible. They should be credible, and I think we should not take this work with a grain of salt, but really think of what she's saying here as a witnessed truth, particularly that the book here, which I'm sorry we were talking about her book. This is Caryll Houselander's book, Guilt, is split into 4 parts. And as you previously mentioned, part 4, she mentions illustrations, and I think there's 10 or 11 people in here that she compares, and through her own witness. And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, I think you're extremely right that she should certainly not be discounted, even despite this lack of official training, especially because of the unique space that she occupies, not only in time, but also in talent. I've never really quite heard of another person with her role where, if a priest is sending someone to her for help, then you know that they have a certain degree of confidence in her. And of course, she would give all the power back to God. So not any sort of healing powers of her own, but just a unique understanding and a compassion. And I think almost just that role of friend, where a lot of people who were going through things that she was helping them with were oftentimes feeling the lack of either companionship or someone who understood. And in terms of the industry as a whole, she, I think, was unique in that sense and also very helpful, because at that time, any professional, and still today to a certain degree, any professional who was available was either outright hostile to the faith or took it with a grain of salt and sort of scoffed at it, right? So I've talked to people who still experience this today, and over on the Catholic Exchange podcast, I have interviewed some Catholic mental health professionals who luckily are really growing that industry, but in her time, that was really not something that was easily come by. So I think just having the faith affirmed and not denied or attacked right off the bat, that was very helpful and put people at ease. But then also to not outright reject the medical findings of the field of psychiatry either, which was sort of an overreaction that some within the church did have. So it's this striking this balance that she does in a very particular way, and that I don't think was very common at that time.
Wow. And of course, she helped so many people while she was here on Earth, and then since she's been gone all these years, continues to really help people. And I know in this book, for example, I mean, she really helps us kind of look at ourselves and accept our own inclinations, our own proclivities, our own nature, and really kind of avoid that escapism that we tend to rely on sometimes to, I don't want to think about that. She kind of helps us kind of confront who we are and why we're here.
Yes, that's one of the themes of the book that really stuck with me, is she discusses the various methods of escape. And that's exactly the word she uses, and I believe at other times she calls it something else, like a mask. But all of these copes, essentially, these elaborate copes to avoid confronting the darker nature of humanity, which includes sin and guilt, and therefore to overcome these things, are just distractions, and they're not really getting to the core of the problem. And so this Band-Aid solution, which I think we see today, continued with the overemphasis in this in the industry of pushing medication above all other types of treatment, is ultimately not going to work in the long run, even in worldly standards, and just feeling better on an emotional level. So never mind the spiritual. She really demonstrates that these distractions don't even work just at a basic natural level, and they in fact make things worse. So someone who's overly obsessed, or so perfectionism, for example, and procrastination, being obsessed with making everything just right, can be a manifestation of pride or of an inability to confront the truth and to accept human limitations. And interestingly, as we probably know from just reading books about virtue, the solution to this is humility. And I believe she quotes St. Catherine of Siena, I think it is, who says that humility is just truth. It's just the facts of what things are. It's not an exaggeration, nor is it underselling yourself. It's the willingness to look in the mirror and to see a fallen human being with faults, but also to see our redemption and to accept God's grace. And it's not too much in either direction, but it's just right. It's just an accurate representation of the facts. And so what all of these masks and distractions lack is a true understanding and assessment of what the actual root of the problem is. And she claims that without that, none of them can actually be solved.
And she helps us lay these at his feet and really kind of open up to God's mercy that he's so eager to shower on us.
Yes, and that is really the message of her book, is ultimately a hopeful one. I know it's easy to look at the book cover with the person in despair and sort of think of it as a dark book. And it does deal with dark themes, but it offers this way out. And it first of all, I think, offers a lot of validation to many of the unspoken feelings and sort of baseline assumptions that we make about our day-to-day lives, and gives you that confidence that, yes, these are not normal, but common, and here's the reason why. And luckily, our faith has built into it, providentially, ways to solve these problems, and ultimately the way to solve the problem of sin, which is our redemption. So it's a book that is ultimately, at the end of the day, a very simple message, and one that we know, but one that really bears repeating and is shown in these, not only the case studies, but also just like her very keen analysis of human nature to just hold true to the tenets of the faith, and that, yes, all along, what the faith taught is now being discovered by psychology, and they are starting to prove it true as well. And so it's kind of like a, yes, I told you so, but not in a snide way, in a, yes, in fact, we have the answer all along.
Well, I'm sure many of us have experienced this personally. So this is something that we can all attest to one way or another when it comes to dealing with past sins and the sacrament of confession. Personally, I was just briefly, I was a convert from as being agnostic or borderline atheist for many, many years, decades, and I came to the church in my 40s. And how do you sit down and just do a general confession when you got a lifetime of sin? You know, you just generally sit down and say, well, I did this, you know, and you're just generalizing things because you're talking about countless, not only countless areas, but countless activities that you're sorry for. And I thought that was it. And yet after the fact, I was bothered by one sin in particular that I felt that I needed to go back and specifically confess. And I was actually told by the priest, you know, your sins have been absolved. That was good enough. And I said, I don't feel like it. I mean, there was something there. It's, you know, that I think there's a fable, if I've got it right, that there's this the princess with the pea underneath the mattress. You know, I mean,
yes,
you're aware that it's there and it's going to bother you. And I never felt such a relief by going in and addressing that one sin particularly. And maybe that was the whole purpose of healing me. I don't know, but I can't describe it other than a night and day difference once that was done. I even cried because I thought that it would be over just generalizing it. And in some cases it's not. And I think that's where each one of us specifically knows a sense of guilt, in trying to get to the bottom of what that guilt is, honing in on it and calling it out and getting rid of it.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful testimony, and I'm glad that you had that experience of healing and of actually feeling forgiven, because that's something a lot of people struggle with, is to overcome. I mean, a lot of times after we go to confession, it does feel good, but sometimes you're still beating yourself up over the sin, or you can't remember, or the embarrassment or something like that. And to be able to experience that healing is definitely such a grace. And in terms of a general confession, it's such a great idea, and the saints recommend it, even for cradle Catholics, even for people who are not converts, especially those coming back after a long period away, though, obviously. But it's something that can be done ahead of sacraments or just generally throughout, if it's been a while since you have done a general confession. And even though the sins have already been forgiven, there are graces to be gained through the sacrament, and especially help against future temptations against those sins, and remediation of the pain due to the sin. So the time in purgatory, for example, can be helped along by that general confession. And another, I know I keep recommending books, but another Sophia book that discusses this, I think we might have talked about, called Rooting Out Hidden Faults, which is about the particular examined. So that is a really great tool to bring to a general confession. It's an examination of conscience that's not based on the 10 Commandments, but rather on the 7 deadly sins. And so it gets at a lot of those things that often manifest as personality traits, so like road rage or an anger issue or something that you just kind of think is an immutable part of your character and can never be done away with. The particular examen says, nope, this is something that likely it's disordered. It comes from one of the 7 deadly sins. And a lot of times when this manifests in your life, it's not necessarily something that breaches the threshold of sin. So when feelings of anger, for example, or feelings of envy, if they're very frequent, but they kind of just hit that level of temptation, you don't give in to the sin, can still mean that the sin is your predominant fault. And so the ability to really be introspective and to figure that out about yourself, and then to bring it to the healing graces of the sacrament, can only really ever be useful, no matter where you are in your life or in your conversion.
So true. Kristen Van Uden is our guest here from Sophia Institute Press, and we're talking about the book Guilt by Caryll Houselander, a spiritual classic, but also a literary classic. And even though this book was written well over 50 years ago, it seems like it's more and more relevant every single day, because as she states, the most striking characteristic of the age in which we're living is psychological suffering, which she's named ego neurosis, a disease of the soul, a spiritual rather than psychological ailment. And I got to tell you, Kristen, with all of the we see such a rise in mental health issues right now, more attention to it, and it seems like it's more widespread. And so this book really speaks to us in the here and the now, So a very kind of a must-read, I think, to kind of settle our soul and take a good look at ourselves. And she really helps us do that.
Definitely. And that term ego neurosis, I think, is this kind of a catch-all term for every mental illness and every issue. And it's useful in that it covers basically everything. So if you're thinking, oh, maybe this book isn't going to address my particular problem, that list that she has, it covers almost any manifestation of suppressed guilt. And she talks about, I think she calls the chapter the wrong repression, because, of course, psychologists would be familiar with Freud's terms of repression, but she talks about not repressing our base instincts, but repressing guilt as obviously the main problem. So today, it's definitely relevant. The main connection I make today is that it's almost as if absolution has been abolished, because this affirmation that is sort of rampant in the culture of these anti virtuous lifestyles, for example, is something where it's really damaging to the person in the long run. So we have this sort of theology of nice, where you can't offend anyone, but that's actually not true charity, because to be charitable is to speak the truth to someone. So I think today a lot of the problem with guilt is that it's been declared dead, because people are feeling guilt over sometimes legitimate reasons. And because sin no longer exists in this relativistic culture, of course, guilt no longer exists, and guilt is just a pathology rather than the actual spiritual pathology, which is sin. So the human soul does not change. So feeling guilt over sin stays the same, but without the actual means to appropriate that guilt and to resolve it, people are adopting instead this constant affirmation of sin. And, oh, you do you have your truth, I have mine, all of that. And it's really bad for the human soul to do that, because the guilt doesn't go away no matter how much you dress it up and how much you deny that it should exist or that it does exist.
And you mentioned early in this hour here, you didn't really say this, but there's guilt and there's Catholic guilt. And you hear about Catholic guilt all the time. But the difference is Catholic guilt has a means to deal with that, the sacrament of confession. You can unburden yourself. You can lay this guilt at Jesus' feet, where, as you're describing now, people just hang out of this guilt, and it becomes, well, there's nothing I can do about it, so I might as well keep doing what I'm doing, So, but right. Catholic guilt, although it's used disparagingly, I think is a healing guilt, or can be a healing guilt.
Yes, exactly. Catholic guilt is the only guilt that goes away.
Yeah,
so
right.
They've got it wrong.
Well, it was interesting that you said earlier, in reference to guilt, this covering of up, and I correlated that with just recently hearing one of the folks that we air during the day here on Catholic Radio, a professional. They were asked a question regarding this, I wouldn't say mysterious. I think they called it something along the line of mysterious, but it's just odd that we're seeing so much of this gay pride and so much of celebrating things that probably shouldn't be celebrated. And they wanted to know why. And the professional chuckled actually and said, well, they just don't want to feel guilty. So he could easily see that a lot of this is suddenly being celebrated, because if you celebrate it as something acceptable, or you try to get people to appreciate it as something that's acceptable, and even go so far as to celebrate it, all of a sudden it's not such a bad thing. But it's not going to address their deep down concerns, because they've just kind of swept it under the rug. At some point, it's going to come back, and they're still going to question: is their behavior is it really good?
Right. I think you make a good point that this celebration is really an overcompensation for this feeling of guilt, because if it were something normal or beautiful or good or true or acceptable, then you wouldn't need to be lobbying to this great degree to convince yourselves and others that it is right. So it's really a great point. This unresolved guilt is causing this obsession and this really militant celebration culture of sinful lifestyles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, circling back what we talked about, these communist regimes, the book that you're currently writing, I mean, that's the way you get things done. You do it very, very militant-like, correct? I mean, you've got an ideology, you're going to shove it down somebody's throat.
Yeah, I mean, the gender ideology is a perfect example of this soft communism that's infiltrated the West, because cancel culture has demonstrated that relativism will only go so far. If you hold certain Catholic opinions, then your opinions are not respected and they're not allowed. So it's really not anything goes. It's anything disordered goes almost.
Yeah.
And the one thing not tolerated in the culture of tolerance is the teachings of the Catholic Church. So,
and circling back to this book, though, I mean, we can easily see, she's trying to explain that this is not a good thing. This is something in going about doing things this way. It is not good for the human person, because it dismisses what they really need, a substantial healing in their life.
Right. And the total suspension of free will, too. I found it really interesting that she talks about collective guilt, and her analysis of both the Nazi regime and communism was fascinating to me, where she discusses these ideologies as a replacement for religion, because of the guilt that the people felt at throwing off their old religion after the series of revolutions that really kicked off with the French Revolution and continued throughout the ideological revolution of atheism into the 20th century. They needed a replacement religion. As Father Vincent Michelli, who wrote this book called The Gods of Atheism, puts it, there is really no absence of worship. Atheism is the worship of idols instead. There's a human impulse to worship something. So she writes really compellingly of this collective self-hatred and turning in on yourself that happens when you take God out of his place, and how that can actually be so damaging and dangerous because it organizes itself into a collective worship of man, really, and of this cult of personality that surrounds the dictators, and how really if each of the individuals in that system would, instead of replacing or substituting this false ideology in the place where religion should be, then they wouldn't feel this need to martyr themselves for a false cause. And ultimately, as goes with her thesis, this is because of the unresolved guilt that's pushing them to do this, to cope and compensate in ways that will never bring them relief, but that they falsely think will, because they refuse to look towards the one thing that can bring them relief.
So there are those that say that that a little guilt is a good thing.
Oh.
That it gives you that sense of shame. Without guilt, there's no shame. What do you think Caryll would say to someone who presented her with that idea?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because one thing that I wish had been covered in more depth in the book that wasn't really is that difference between guilt and shame. And I know that the modern parlance kind of refers to shame as a societal construct and guilt as a personal feeling, or maybe I have that backwards. But one is a societal thing that's sort of foisted upon the individual, and the other is an actual inherent feeling coming from the individual. So I thought that would have been an interesting discussion, is how are these feelings of guilt conditioned by the society we live in, and how many of them are real and coming from a reaction to sin, but how many are from false expectations, even from evil people, especially living in a society where you almost sometimes feel guilty for being a Catholic because you're told, oh, you're intolerant, you're a bigot, whatever. That can produce a feeling of shame, but one that is wrong because it's not rooted in committing a wrongdoing or a sin. And then another thing I think she doesn't particularly address is the role of trauma, because trauma can also produce feelings of guilt that are unmoored, that do not really have any reason. And the person may be perfectly virtuous and free from habitual sin, but still has this feeling of guilt because of having been targeted or persecuted or hurt in this way before. So that, I think, was beyond her scope it would be interesting to see if she were writing today with what we know about trauma from recent medical advances, how she might have changed her writings or added upon them, but sadly, we will never know.
Yeah.
So you speak about, just quickly, a false guilt, if I understand you correctly. So that would be, as an example, somebody that witnesses an auto accident and somebody, die in front of them, something that they may not have had any way to influence an outcome. That this person was definitely going to die, but they feel guilty that they didn't do anything or they didn't do enough. Do I understand?
Yeah, it's the bystander effect.
Yeah. So quickly, you've only got a couple more minutes, but I just address a curiosity of mine. Of course, I haven't read the book yet, but I do plan to do so, hopefully in the near future. But part 2, she addresses a chapter on the real repression. What is that?
Yeah, so I think we briefly mentioned before, but she believes that the real repression is the repression of healthy guilt, and instead of she's addressing Freud head on right here because he, of course, believes that human freedom comes from liberating ourselves from the societally imposed restrictions on basically animalistic-based behavior and giving in to all of your urges and concupiscible nature, and basically giving in to sin and throwing off the shackles of the soul. And she says, no, that's not really the repression we should be worried about. And what the real repression is repressing your soul in that way. Yeah. And repressing true human nature by denying its existence, denying the existence of the soul. And one of the keys to that is repressing of the conscience, which is what guilt really is a function of.
Which we see so much today.
Yeah.
Yeah. What great words of wisdom for today, by the way.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So the book is Guilt by Caryll Houselander, and Kristen Van Uden's been our guest. Kristen, how do people get their hands on this book?
You can get it right at sophiainstitute.com.
Easy enough.
Yes.
Got to do that. And always a pleasure to chat with you. So glad you could take some time with us today, Kristen. A fascinating conversation. And what an interesting woman Caryll Houselander was. So, again, the book is available from Sophia Institute Press. Kristen, let's chat again, shall we?
Absolutely.
Please. Thank you.
Great. And next week, Shane and I will be here, and Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, the dynamic deacon, will be our guest.
Yeah, and he is dynamic.
Yes, he is. Cup of coffee, we're wide awake for Deacon Harold. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Thank you.